The effects of media violence on aggressive behaviour has been a contentious issue over the years. Since the 1960s, researchers have investigated the short and long-term correlation between television, movies, and video game violence on behaviour. Some suggest that children may be influenced to act aggressively by the media through imitation. Others propose only a small positive correlation between violence in the media and aggressiveness, not a causation. Because of the implication of aggressive behaviour on society, studies continue to examine how media can increase this type of reaction. The study Chronic Violent Video Game Exposure and Desensitization to Violence, Behavioral and Event-Related Brain Potential Data by Bruce D. Bartholow, Brad J. Bushman, and Mark A. Sestia examines the effect of video game violence on brain processes with regards in particular to desensitization. Desensitization is defined as diminished psychological or emotional responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated exposure to it. Becoming desensitized to blood and gore can have detrimental social consequences, including the reduction of inhibition when acting violently. At the time of this study, the authors noted that few studies had examined the effects of violent media on brain processes, and no studies had examined the potential links between physiological indices of desensitization and aggressive behavior. Bartholow theorized that desensitization should be reflected in the amplitude of the P300 component of event-related brain potential, or ERP. The P300 wave is an ERP element in the process of decision-making. It is thought to reflect the processes involved in stimulation or categorization. ERPs are voltage deflection in the electroencephalogram that reflect different processing activities in the brain and the evaluation of emotionally relevant stimuli. Large P300 amplitudes are reflected when negative target images are shown amongst neutral images. The researchers suggested that when an individual is desensitized to violence, the P300 should be reduced. Desensitization theoretically weakens individuals to be aversive towards violence. Therefore, the study aimed to demonstrate that there should be an inverse relationship between P300 amplitudes invoked by repeated exposure to violent media and demonstrations of aggressive behavior. The study aimed to test the theory that violent media can have ongoing effects, as opposed to short-term priming that other critics have suggested. The authors hypothesized that violent video game players would demonstrate deficits in P300 amplitude to violent images, but not to negative non-violent images in comparison to non-violent video game players. They hypothesized that violent video game players would be more aggressive in the competitive task and that P300 amplitude would decrease when behaving aggressively. They also predicted that these effects would be ongoing when individual differences in aggressiveness were statistically controlled. 39 male undergraduates volunteered for participation in the study with a mean age of 19 and a half, normal vision, and all right-handed. The participants volunteered in exchange for course credit. They were recruited using the internet, advertising a study of reaction times to picture viewing. One drawback of this method of recruitment is that they were all roughly the same age and only male, which may call into question the generalizability of the study across the population. In addition, they were chosen by convenience rather than samples drawn at random from the population, which doesn't take into account different socioeconomic statuses or cultures. Participants listed their 5 favourite video games, rating how often they played and the violence portrayed in them. Researchers formed an overall index of violent video game exposure, referring to individuals with relatively high scores as violent video game players. However, they were not specifically grouped. Players were assessed with the irritability scale and the aggression questionnaire. They were told that they were competing with other participants in their reaction time. They were told that the slower player would receive a blast of noise, the intensity and duration of which was selected by the player for their partner prior to the game. This selection of noise duration and intensity was how researchers measured aggression. Following each round, the participants were given visual cues such as "you won" and "you lost." However, it was actually a computer-controlled test. The EEG was recorded with 28 electrodes in an electrocap. The largest positive peak of P300 was selected for each participant. The participants were asked also to rate a number of neutral, negative nonviolent, and violent images on a scale from 1 to 9. Participants viewed a total of 480 images. After the picture viewing task and the competitive task, participants were interviewed for suspicion, debriefed, and dismissed. When examining the results, the authors showed that the predicted interaction between the different neutral, negative, and violent images and video game exposure scores were significant. P300 amplitudes to violent images decreased when violence increased. The negative non-violent images and the neutral images were not affected by violent video game exposure, which supports the hypothesis that violent video game players are specifically desensitized to violence. Bartholow and co-authors' findings were consistent with work showing that aggressive individuals tend to show deficits in P300 amplitude during simple discrimination tasks, and that frequent exposure to video game violence may have long-term consequences on aggression. These findings were the first to link violent video games with a reduction in brain activity associated with desensitization. However, considering this study is cross-sectional and not longitudinal, it may not as accurately predict the long-term effects, as there is no data of participants' levels of aggression prior to the study. The authors acknowledge this and reflect on the need for further research in this area. The implications of this study may be able to link violence desensitization to aggressive behavioral disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder, which is typified by low arousal in aversive motivational system. The researchers also suggest that the study may be used to measure aggression in adolescent boys with conduct disorders, showing abnormally low autonomic responses to specific images. The authors noted that while their hypotheses showed a link to violent video game playing and desensitization leading to aggression, there was no test for potential mediators of this effect. They suggested the need for further research on previous violence exposure, as the brain response to violent images did not account for the effect of violence exposure on aggression.